Welcome back. You're watching Business Plus. Trade deficit has widened to a record high in the month of October. India's merchandise trade deficit for October 2023 came in at 18% higher year on year at $31.46 billion from $26.3 billion in October of 2022 as per government data released today. Now, trade deficit rose on the back of imports which rose 11% year on year to $65.03 billion from $57.91 billion a year ago. Exports were also up 6% year on year to $33.57 billion from $31.6 billion. Now, Commerce Secretary attributed the rise in merchandise imports to a 95% rise in imports of gold on an annual basis. In the services sector, exports in October were valued at $28.70 billion, with imports standing at $14.32 billion. September services exports were valued at $29.37 billion and imports at $14.91 billion. Net, not much of a change in the services sector. Shifting focus for now, the government is set to invite bids for 20 critical mineral blocks in the next 2 weeks, opening the sector up for private players. Post the auction notice, all stakeholders will be brought together and a national level strategy for mining and processing of critical minerals will be made. The 20 critical minerals block proposed by the government for bidding include lithium and graphite mines, critical for India's energy transition plans. The government recently identified a slew of critical minerals, including new age minerals like lithium, cobalt and titanium, which are important to meet the needs for sectors like electronics, telecom, transport, as well as defense. My colleague Karthik Malhotra here with me in the studio. Karthik, hi, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, Shweta.
This is a story we continue to track, has a bearing on India's energy transition, its plan for a sustainable future. There is a lot going to happen here. Run us through the process. How does it work? What really happens when the bidding starts?
So, Shweta, I think the auction is going to, or these blocks of mines as we call them, or minerals as we call them, are going to go under the hammer in about 2 weeks' time or so. That is when the announcement will come, and there's going to be a scheduled period for those auction bids to arrive, and thereafter the government is going to open those bids and allocate blocks to certain players who qualify both on technical as well as cost parameters. Now, what is really up for grabs? I think one part of the equation is very clear. That we are talking about India's energy transition, right? So this is where blocks of lithium become very critical, and this is where blocks of even nickel become very critical, because they directly feed into India's requirement to be self-sustained when it comes to our own energy needs for electric mobility. And remember, our target is to arrive at a 30% of our commercial vehicle, private vehicle fleet to be electric by 2030. Obviously, there's a large use case here. But there are also use cases for non-energy based minerals which go into many other sorts of components, which are integral parts of finished products as well as the entire manufacturing assembly of components. So I think it will be interesting to look at each of these one by one, and maybe I'll just run through lithium first. So look at the demand for lithium. Lithium's demand in India was worth about 13,600 crore rupees or so last year, and that has gone up all the way to about 23,000 crore rupees. Now, this is the quantum of imports of lithium that India has done in the last 1 year, jumping from FY22 to FY23. Now, let's look at where this lithium is really imported from, and that is going to actually make a very, very critical case for us to understand that why mining lithium in India becomes really important. So there you have it on the map. China is the biggest sort of exporter of lithium to the world, and India continues to draw in its import surplus, its import requirements from China. In addition to that, you've got United States, you've got Argentina, you've got Hong Kong, Japan, as well as Australia. Now, these are all lithium rich countries. We import from them. Obviously, there is a cost to those imports. Now, once we start making lithium here, mining lithium and using that raw material into our own energy needs, it obviously has a bearing on our current account deficit, which should narrow and hopefully move to a surplus at some point. Let's look at some other minerals. Let's look at titanium, for example, right? Titanium again becomes a very, very critical, important mineral And let's look at where all titanium is really going to be used. To begin with, titanium is an integral part, that goes into the alloy of aluminum, etc., to make engines, to make automobile components. And even more recently, we are talking about the iPhone 15, which is made in India and has a titanium casing, and that titanium casing up until now coming from Wistron, and Wistron recently been acquired by Tata Steel. So obviously in electronic components, casing, etc., titanium becomes a very, very key critical element to not import into the country and really mine out of our own natural resources and use. Now, where are we importing titanium from? Let's try to go back to the map and see which are the titanium rich countries in the world which we really need to or are dependent on when it comes to the world of importing titanium. Now, there you have it. So overall, you see about Korea and China put together are catering to about
50%.
half, exactly 50% of India's total imports of titanium. The other countries happen to be Germany, Japan, as well as the Netherlands. So overall, if you look at this mix, you know that again China and Korea, China more so, continues to be a dominant player and has done this process of auctioning its own mines and opening it to the private sector to become a large player when it comes to titanium exports. Now, let's move on to another sector. Let's talk about nickel, for example. I think nickel, again, when we talk about India's energy transition and when we don't talk about really electric mobility, nickel becomes another key component that goes into traditional nickel-cadmium batteries. What are these nickel-cadmium batteries used for? All sorts of electronics, all sort of electrical products, etc. And again, nickel becomes one of these key elements that goes into anything that we need when it is, whether it is solar voltaic cells and the transmitters, transformers used to transmit that energy, and any sort of other conduction requirements in the electrical, electronic space, energy space, nickel becomes a very, very critical mineral there. So in addition to that, manufacturing engines, components within engines, coating on engines, etc., nickel becomes, because it is also corrosion resistant, etc., it is used as coating to go over components and prevent some sort of rusting or any sort of oxidization. And look at the countries that we are dependent on when it comes to nickel. Again, it's a fairly large pie that you will see where, incidentally, it is not China but US which is a great supplier of nickel. In fact, 30% of India's demand for nickel is fulfilled by the USA. So broadly, Shweta, these are the three main critical components which get opened as part of those 20 when we really talk about India's overall advantage on mining its own natural resources, wealth of natural resources. Some of them recently discovered, some that we've known have existed for a while. But overall, this whole story of energy transition, self-reliance, being independent and not dependent on the rest of the world, I think all of this augments very well with the government opening or at least initiating the auction process for for the natural resources, including rare earth minerals, as well as some elements which are not in the mineral space, maybe in the metal space, and to go into the whole process of manufacturing in addition to serving just the energy transition needs. I think India's overall dependence on the rest of the world, given the geopolitical environment that we are living in right now, augurs very well for India's future.
Okay, and so far we know there are about 10 to 12 contenders who could be actively participating in mining and the bidding process, firstly to begin with. What is there to gain? I mean, talk about some of these players, and we know some of these players are major metals and steel players in India. There's going to be a long haul process. They'll first bid, then start operating. What is there to gain for these companies?
Oh, a lot, Shweta. I think to begin with, number one, these companies have had JVs in other parts of the world which are mineral rich. They operate offshore entities, and these entities obviously responsible through special purpose vehicles or other M&As with other countries, where you actually dig up the earth and produce or sort of discover rare earth minerals and elements and metals. Now, with this sector opening up within India itself, obviously for the players, it becomes a great advantage because you are in your home country and you don't really need to pay any sort of import duties when it comes to getting these products back into India. For Indian manufacturers at large, whether you talk about batteries or whether you talk about electric mobility or you talk about semiconductors or you talk about practically any metal alloy based industry, you are not now dependent on importing it from abroad, and at some level in some time in the future this demand partly if not fully gets fulfilled from within the country itself.
So there's going to be a lot of competition there.
I think competition already exists. For the bidding process, yeah, obviously. I think, any company which is seriously looking at expanding its mining activities anywhere in the world, and if it happens to be an Indian company, obviously will see immense value in digging up India's own natural resources and getting access to those blocks for a sustained period of time, and generate as much, discover and process as much of these rare earth minerals as they can, and not just provide them as raw material input into Indian industries, but the entire export market also opens up. So there is going to be, of course, a bidding war. We will have the likes of Tata Steel, JSW,
Vedanta.
Jindal Steel, Vedanta, Hindalco, many of these companies which are into the mining industry are going to want to exploit this opportunity. Now, what does the government stand to gain from this? Of course, there is a 3% royalty on lithium and a 1% royalty on all other minerals that get mined, or rare earth minerals that get mined. And by one way, the government gets royalty because this is, at the end of the day, sovereign land of India. Government of India has owned this land thus far. And so there is a royalty component, and in addition to that, obviously by way of profits that these companies will make on the basis of the raw material they are able to extract, there is a tax called corporate tax, which in any case gets paid. So it seems to be a win-win for Indian industry, for the mining industry, and for Government of India. And overall, at some point, if we are able to bring down prices and that import dependence gets more than offset with what we are able to generate out of India, then prices eventually should go down. So overall, even for the consumers, it is going to be a winning proposition. But all of this lying right now in the realm of discovery, speculation that we will find enough and more of these rare earth minerals. And this is where I think the government also wants the private sector to partake, make those investments in geological surveys and digging up and putting in earth moving equipment and putting up factories to process them. I think partly the responsibility and the burden is on the private sector, and then the rewards are also for the private sector to gain.
All right, joint responsibility, joint rewards is what we are looking at. Also important to point out, it was in the month of August that government had decided to open up rare mineral blocks up for mining and auctioning for private players, and that is going to be a reality very soon. 2 weeks from now, the bidding process for rare earth minerals blocks will open up. But moving on for now, what are the chances of a global disruption in 2024? 2 wars in, high interest rate regimes and global recession. If these factors worry you, you're not alone. Economist Intelligence Unit Risk Outlook 2024 evaluated some of the top events that could have severe impact on core economic and geopolitical forecast, and found the above mentioned factors could weigh in on growth factors and growth prospects for the future. What are these factors? Let's find out. High interest rate regime, war, uncertainty, recession. What are these factors? What could dampen growth for 2024 for the world at large?
Right. So, Shweta, I think what the Economist Intelligence Unit EIU has done fairly well is that they've been able to drop a list of 10 risks that the world is staring at as it enters 2024. Now, these risks have been categorized as political risks, military risks, economic risks, as well as environmental risks. So these are the 4 broad categories, and within each of these 10 risks, the Economist Intelligence Unit has also been able to assign a certain probability ranging from low to high and moderate in between, as well as the impact that it is likely to have on the world. So, I think let's run our viewers through some of these risks, and some of them are indeed really interesting and exciting. So what you see, this is pretty much, we've taken it almost exactly from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the ones that you see in blue, marked in dark blue, not this light blue climate change, the ones marked in dark blue are the ones that are political in nature. The ones marked in yellow or orange are the ones which are economic in nature, and the ones marked in red are military in nature. So let's take all of them one by one, should we? I think let's start with the political risks and talk about US administration's new foreign policy. Could this strain alliances as they exist in the world today? Now remember, 2024 is a critical year when more than half the world goes into polls. We'll discuss the fallout of that also subsequently, but US being a critical sort of first mover when it comes to defining the world order as we see it, and hence you will see that any sort of change in policy by way of elections in US next year could weigh in very, very clearly on the rest of the world. Now what happens? What is the scenario here? The scenario is that what if you had Joe Biden or the Democrats exit US? If that exit happens, a direct impact on India, which is right now a preferred, favored nation as opposed to China, that advantage moves. And if the Republicans come to power, China gets to sort of renegotiate and reset the trade order and the world order as we see it. The next one is, again, sticking to the political theme. We are talking about trust in political institutions undermined by AI. We spoke about elections. About 60% of the world, to be precise, is going to be voting in 2024. Now, what really happens? What happens when artificial intelligence, and we've seen the power of deep fake. In fact, all of pretty much last week, Shweta, we've discussed and we've seen the ugly side of deep fakes. Now, what if deep fake and AI prompted engineering is deployed to make people believe things that were never said? Speeches, images, videos surfacing out of nowhere or surfacing out of engines, man-made doctored videos and any sort of content. Could that redefine the way elections are going to be deciding the fate of political parties? If that happens, and if there is a growing distrust in political leadership, that becomes obviously a great point of reckoning with respect to AI. The third point, again sticking to the political theme, the third point is industrial action disrupting global productivity. What is meant by this? We are talking specifically about something that is playing out right now in the world. What is playing out? We've seen the auto strike in US on account of wages just about coming to an end. We've seen a Hollywood strike coming to an end in the US. And as those strikes are ending, we are seeing in Bangladesh there is strife again on wage hike. So industrial workers up in arms, trying to battle inflation, trying to continue reaping the rewards of cost of living through the employment that gets generated for them, and really talking to power and standing up against the powers that be, that their wages need to get hiked. And if their wages are not hiked, they are not able to beat inflation, it becomes a challenge, it becomes a problem. So this is again a major political risk that could unfold in 2024 and define how industries are going to continue reaping in profits or head into some sort of corrections. Let's move on to economic risks. Let's talk about the high interest rates that you spoke about earlier, Shweta. Now, high interest rates have been a problem all of this year. For all practical purposes, I think the general sentiment right now, the general belief, which is also getting echoed in the Economist Intelligence Unit report, is that perhaps the days of high interest cycle and further hikings have come to an end. There are unlikely to be any further tightening of monetary policy, at least in the US, even though we are seeing still some sort of tightening happening in other parts of the world. So if there is this high interest rate cycle by virtue of higher inflation, by virtue of military risks, which we will come to subsequently, then there could be further pressure on oil, further pressure on the dollar, further pressure on interest rates, and that could again increase borrowing cost for industries, and that becomes a large political risk. Now, this risk, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, is moderate in probability, but if it does happen, then it has a high impact on the rest of the world. So let's move on to the next economic risk that we're talking about, and this one is critical again: green subsidies. What is happening right now is that between the US and the European Union, on both ends of the Atlantic, there is a subsidy war which is on. What is the subsidy war? I think this clean energy transition is something that all developed countries in the world, and including fast developing countries like ours, like India, have agreed to, that there needs to be a very, very affirmative change when it comes to energy and our dependence on non-renewable fossil fuel based energy. Now, what happens if these two countries start subsidizing their own industries and start subsidizing their own component makers to really get into this green energy transition? Who tends to gain from all of this? The gain is going to accrue to China, and China, by virtue of in any case producing cheaper components, could prefer either US or Europe and really make this tussle between US and Europe in energy transition even more rife. Now, according to the Economist, this is a moderate probability, but again a high risk. Okay, now let's come to China. Now, what is China really going to do? And this is of concern to the entire subcontinent of India that we live in. China exceeding its control and entering into Taiwan becomes a big challenge. Now, it's a low probability risk, but if this really happens, it's a very high impact. What happens? China annexes Taiwan. When it enters Taiwan, Taiwan becomes, of course, is one of the leading electronics manufacturer in the world. And all the AI that we talk about, and US banning export of NVIDIA chips and other high powered GPUs into China is threatened automatically, simply because the semiconductors that power all these GPUs are made in Taiwan. And if China annexes Taiwan, then pretty much all the electronics boom that we are seeing, AI boom that we are seeing, the balance of advantage tilts completely in favor of China. Hopefully, low probability should continue to be a low to no probability, because if this were to happen, then we are really looking at a major long-term economic impact for the world. Let's move on. What's the next risk we are talking about? Let's move to the military risks in action. There is, of course, this ongoing war for the last 1.5 years plus in Ukraine and Russia. Now, what if this actually becomes a global war? Not a low probability, but a very, very low probability here. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to further fuel global tensions, and the relationship between the Western countries and Russia could lead to some sort of increase in military risks. The Economist says that this is very low probability, but if this were to happen, it is very high impact, but thankfully a very, very low probability. Let's move on to the next risk we are talking about. We are talking about, okay, we've done China annexing Taiwan. This becomes now a military risk, as it was even a political risk. And we've spoken about this, so maybe we can move on to the next one, where we are again looking at, again, the Economist says that this is low probability, very high impact, but if Taiwan were to get annexed by China, then it obviously becomes a problem. Sticking to military risks, Israel-Hamas war. If that war extends to the rest of the Middle East, and if countries like Iran were to get more directly or indirectly involved, either through Hezbollah or through Lebanon or through any other route, and the fact that Iran has a support system coming in from China, coming in from Russia, this entire belt could eventually get engulfed in a war. It seems like very low probability, but if this were to happen, we are talking about non-energy transition, present day reality, that this region pretty much fulfilling energy demands for the rest of the world. If this war were to extend beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza and Hamas as we know it, and Palestine, then this could obviously become a problem. The last risk is the climate change, and climate change disrupting global supply chains. This again is a risk which is in the environment space. Now, extreme weather conditions in India itself, we've seen an El Nino like situation. We have seen delayed monsoons, and we've seen what that has done to food prices, food inflation in India. Now, the rest of the world has actually accused India of adding to global inflation, global food inflation. Why? Because India had to curtail its exports of rice, essential commodities, as well as wheat. So, if global climate change, which is sporadic right now, starts to develop into a pattern, then what we are really looking at overall in the world is high inflation. High inflation means higher interest rates, and higher interest rates means lower growth, because the cost of borrowing, cost of capital increases. So these are the 10 risks to watch out for in 2024, ranging from very low risks to very low probability to high probability, and from very high impact to low impact.
One of the risks that stood out for me, very high probability, is the climate change risk. As you pointed out, could have a very medium to low impact, but there is a chance that that will happen, and when that happens, it's going to play up on the supply chains across the world.
Absolutely. So I think what we have seen, Shweta, this time around in India itself has been the El Nino-like situation. We've seen sporadic rains, we've seen a delayed monsoon, and we've seen what has happened to the crop cycle. From tomato prices to onion prices to rice production, which India had in abundance, but wanted to protect it and wanted to subsidize it to feed the domestic population rather than opening it up for exports. So global supply chains could get disrupted.
Absolutely.
If these sporadic rainfalls or drought-like situations become a pattern and attack the world in a synchronous rather than an asynchronous ad hoc manner.
All right. Thank you very much, Karthik, for that very detailed explanation. That is, of course, as per the Economist Intelligence Unit, 10 important risks, factors that you need to be wary of or worried about in 2024, with a very low probability to a very high probability, and the impact that they could likely have on the growth prospects. But with that, we have run out of time on this show. Thank you very much for watching.